Hi everyone. Today I'll be going through the fed state. So firstly, what is the fed state? The fed state is a particular state of the body that occurs usually during a meal or immediately after a meal and lasts for about 4 to 6 hours, sorry. It is a state when essentially the food that you've consumed is being converted by the body into its individual macromolecules, so carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and being absorbed by cells in the body. So in today's video, I'll just be going through the very basic overview of what particular absorption is happening in the three main organs that are involved in the fed state. So firstly, we have the liver, the adipose tissue, and skeletal muscle. Now, these three organs are the main organs that are involved in the fed state and what comes with starvation, which is the fasted state. So, starting off with skeletal muscle. As I mentioned before, there are three main macromolecules that are present in the food that we eat. One are carbohydrates, so glucose, as well as other monosaccharides, but we'll be specifically focusing on glucose. We have also proteins, so amino acids. And we also have triglycerides, which are fats. So, firstly, let's start with glucose. Skeletal muscle is one of the most important organs in the body because it essentially allows for locomotion, structure, maintaining heat, as in body temperature through shivering, as well as many other functions. So, because it has so many functions, you would expect it to need a lot of energy. That's why a lot of glucose that's absorbed in the body is taken through to skeletal muscle and stored as what we call glycogen. Now, glycogen is a molecule that is essentially many glucose 1 phosphate molecules, with obviously the phosphate group removed, joined together in sort of a polymer shape. And these molecules are quite hygroscopic, meaning that they attract water, and also they're quite branched. So this has two advantages. One is that it's able to be cleaved off, so the individual monomers, because they're branched, the instead of the molecule being like this and enzymes having very limited access to the molecule to break apart it's structured more like this, which means that enzymes are easily able to access many parts of the molecule and take away these glucose 1 phosphate molecules. So carbohydrates such as glucose are mainly and in great volumes absorbed into skeletal muscle and undergo a process called glycogenesis, which essentially just means the formation of glycogen to be stored as glycogen in skeletal muscle. Now, as you may have heard from many of your bodybuilder friends, protein is also a very, very important part of the diet in order for the building of muscles. So proteins are another macromolecule that are absorbed into skeletal muscle. And this can be for either the repair of muscles itself or for also the operation of muscles. Amino acids and proteins have a large role in muscles. Just before I forget, in terms of the transfer of glucose into skeletal muscle, you might be wondering how that occurs. So, in fact, there are special protein transporters that are present on the cell membranes of skeletal muscle cells, and these are called GLUT4 transporters. These GLUT4 transporters are insulin dependent, meaning that, let's say this is the plasma membrane of a cell. Originally, these GLUT4 transporters are present within a vesicle in the cell, and there's a cellular receptor present on the outside of the cell. Being insulin dependent, insulin must first bind to this receptor in order to allow for the activation of the GLUT4 receptors. So the vesicle essentially breaks down, and the GLUT4 receptors are able to go to the surface of the cell and allow for glucose to bind to them and be able to enter the cell. Now, in terms of fats, there isn't actually any fat stored in skeletal muscle. So essentially, fats are not transported in any manner. Now, moving on to adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is one of the most important types of tissue in the body because not only is it a massive store for nutrients, but it also allows for protection, insulation, as well as also the secretion and passage of hormones around the body. Adipose tissue actually contains all three different types of macromolecules, and similar to skeletal muscle, because it's present outside of the liver and brain, it contains GLUT4 transporters. So amino acids, and most importantly, triglycerides can be transported. And triglycerides are mainly stored as lipids, or in their original form as triglycerides. And there are two main ways that lipids are formed or stored in adipose tissue. I'd just like to quickly jump over to the liver, because the liver is also associated with this process. And this process essentially is the formation of what we call lipoproteins. So lipoproteins or lipoproteins form within the liver, and they're essentially triglyceride and protein complexes that allow for the transfer of triglycerides into adipose tissue, because as we know, most triglycerides are absorbed through the small intestine, and therefore they lead to the liver. So these lipoproteins, if we just quickly go through a very basic structure of them, they are essentially a protein casing. So imagine that this entire border is protein, and they contain many different triglyceride, monoglyceride, diglyceride chains within them in order for them to be stored in the adipose tissue. So you may be wondering, how are these lipoproteins eventually absorbed into adipose tissue? So what happens is that we have a special enzyme present in adipose tissue called lipoprotein lipase. And this lipoprotein lipase is important as it allows for the breakdown of triglycerides so that they can be stored within the adipose tissue. Now, in terms of carbohydrates and proteins, carbohydrates can be formed as glycogen, and proteins as amino acids or proteins in cells. So now the final organ that I'd like to look at is the liver. And some would argue that this is probably the most important organ that is involved in the fed state, because not only does it receive all of the blood from the small intestine, but it also receives every single macronutrient that's absorbed. Now, as I mentioned earlier, lipoproteins are formed in the liver, and these lipoproteins allow for the triglycerides and fats to be transported from the liver to adipose tissue in order to be absorbed. But this is not just the only role of the liver. So carbohydrates, they are mainly stored in the liver, although I did mention that skeletal muscle does require a lot of energy. In terms of energy that the whole body can use, this energy comes mainly from glycogen. And once again, it occurs from the process of glycogenesis. There are massive glycogen stores present within the liver, and these are very, very important for the fasting state because they're able to give the body to be able to have energy for up to 12 hours. In terms of proteins, there are also many proteins that are stored in the liver. These can be from amino acids that have undergone protein synthesis, and these proteins are therefore stored within the liver, whether for transportation to other cells in the body, if the cells require specific building blocks for them to survive, transportation to skeletal muscle for skeletal muscle repair, or simply use in the liver for the making of enzymes and many other protein-based molecules in order for the proper operation of the body. There are also fats, which is a major part of storage that are present in the liver. As I mentioned earlier, these fats can be converted to lipoproteins in order to be taken to adipose tissue, but there is also fat stored in the liver. And so in terms of the process of the storage of macromolecules, which are outlined here, these are the main processes that actually occur. Now, there are many further processes that can occur after this does, including glycolysis, the formation of bile salts, which can be used for further digestion, and many, many, many other processes that the body can use to create energy and essentially go about its daily business. But in terms of the fed state and the storage of nutrients, this is the very bare bones overview of what happens in the body.